There's a version of the 1960s most people know: the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Motown, Woodstock. But hiding just beneath that surface is a whole other world of music. Songs recorded in small studios, pressed in tiny numbers, played a handful of times on late-night radio, and then quietly forgotten. Today, we're going back to find them. These are the 10 secret songs from the 1960s you've probably never heard. Number 10, I Had Too Much to Dream, Last Night, by the Electric Prunes. If you've never heard of the Electric Prunes, you're not alone. But the story of how this song came to exist is something worth knowing. The band originally started at Taft High School in Los Angeles, under the name The Sanctions. By 1966, they had changed their name, partly as a joke. Singer James Lowe recalled later that the name Electric Prunes started off as a laugh, but it was the one thing everyone would remember. There's nothing attractive about it, he admitted, nothing sexy, but people wouldn't forget it. That year, they were introduced to record producer Dave Hassinger, who had worked as an engineer for the Rolling Stones. He brought them to rehearse at the home studio of Leon Russell, the same Leon Russell who would go on to become one of the most respected musicians in American rock. During those sessions, something completely accidental happened. The band was recording on a 4-track machine, flipping the tape over to reuse it. Someone cued a tape without hitting record, and the playback came thundering through the studio speakers. The reverberating, oscillating sound that erupted was unlike anything they'd heard. Guitarist Ken Williams had been playing a 1958 Gibson Les Paul with a Bigsby vibrato unit, and the accidental playback captured something raw, backward-sounding, and entirely strange. They saved it. That became the opening of the song. The song itself wasn't written by the band. It was handed to them by two outside songwriters, Annette Tucker and Nancy Mantz, who had originally conceived it as a lush orchestral ballad, something far softer than what the Electric Prunes would do with it. What the band delivered was garage rock wrapped in psychedelia, with that backwards guitar intro announcing something new in American music. Released as a single in November 1966, I Had Too Much to Dream, Last Night, climbed to number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 by early 1967. It later appeared as the opening track on the landmark 1972 compilation Nuggets, which introduced an entire generation to the sounds of 1960s psychedelic and garage rock. The Electric Prunes themselves were largely forgotten after their original lineup dissolved by 1968. Their ambitions had outpaced their label's patience, and the band lost control of their own music before the decade was over. Number 9. Love Song by Lesley Duncan. Lesley Duncan wrote Love Song as a B-side. That's what she called it, a little song she'd knocked up as a suitable B-side. It was released in January 1969. Duncan had been working in the London music scene since the early 1960s. She was in enormous demand as a session vocalist. She sang backing vocals for Dusty Springfield regularly from 1964 to 1972, contributed to the original studio recording of Jesus Christ Superstar, and can be heard on Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. She backed Donovan on his 1969 hit, Barabajagal. She co-wrote 3 songs with Scott Walker for the Walker Brothers, and yet almost no one outside of music industry circles knew her name. A demo of Love Song had been recorded in 1968 by David Bowie and his collaborator John Hutchinson during a period when the two were working together as a duo. The song eventually came to Elton John's attention, and he recorded it as a duet with Duncan herself for his 1970 album Tumbleweed Connection. She sang and played acoustic guitar on the track. In exchange, John played piano on her debut solo album, Sing Children Sing. Years that followed, Love Song was covered by more than 150 artists, including Olivia Newton-John, Barry White, and Marianne Faithfull. Duncan appeared with Elton John at a Royal Festival Hall concert in 1974 to perform the song live, and that recording was included on his Here and There album. Lesley Duncan suffered from debilitating stage fright throughout her career. It was one of the reasons she never built the mainstream profile her songwriting deserved. She died in March 2010, and is considered by music historians to be among Britain's first significant female singer-songwriter. Number 8. Different Drum by the Stone Poneys, featuring Linda Ronstadt. Before Linda Ronstadt became one of the best-selling recording artists in American history, she was the lead singer of a folk rock trio from Los Angeles called the Stone Poneys. In late 1967, they released a song written by Michael Nesmith, who was, at that point, already a member of the Monkees. Nesmith had written Different Drum in 1964, 2 years before the Monkees were assembled. He offered it to the show's producers early on, but was turned down. "It's not a Monkees tune," they told him, so he gave it to the Stone Poneys.
Don't get me wrong, it's not that I knock it, it's just that
What happened in the recording studio, however, was not what Linda Ronstadt had expected. The band's own arrangement of the song had been set aside, and when Ronstadt arrived to record, an entirely new arrangement was waiting. Strings, harpsichord, a different rhythm entirely. The session musicians brought in included future Eagle Bernie Leadon on acoustic guitar and future Derek and the Dominoes drummer Jim Gordon. Ronstadt later said she had been completely confused by what she found, and that she heard fear and a lack of confidence in her own performance on the finished recording. Nesmith heard it differently. He said her vocal had infused the song with a new level of passion and sensuality. That coming from a woman's perspective, the song had taken on an entirely different meaning. Different Drum hit the Billboard Pop Chart on November 11, 1967, and stayed in the Hot 100 for 17 weeks, reaching number 13. It also reached number 12 on the Cashbox chart. It was Ronstadt's first hit record and the beginning of the story most people know. But the recording itself, made quickly by a 21-year-old who felt uncertain, surrounded by session musicians she had barely met, is one of those moments in music that feels both fragile and permanent at the same time. The Stone Poneys disbanded not long after. Ronstadt went solo, and what came next is well-documented history. But this particular recording, made before all of that, deserves to be heard on its own terms. Number 7. Echoes by Gene Clark, with the Gosden Brothers.
And the echoes in your head continue showing.
Gene Clark was one of the founding members of the Byrds. He contributed many of the band's early songs and sang lead on some of their best-known recordings. Then, in early 1966, he walked away. He had developed a severe fear of flying, and the band's touring schedule had become unbearable.
Here the castles you can build out of dreams you have.
His debut solo album, Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers, was recorded during the final week of August 1966 and released in early 1967. It opened with Echoes, a Baroque pop piece unlike anything Clark had recorded with the Byrds. It featured orchestral arrangements, harpsichords, and a lyrical seriousness that was both confessional and literary. The song reflected on the previous years, the early heights of the Byrds, the internal tensions, the strange experience of walking away from something enormous, while still in his mid-20s.
And you look still for a trace of an opening in a place.
The album was ignored almost entirely upon release. It received almost no airplay. It sold very little. Clark himself was barely acknowledged. The producer was Columbia staff producer Larry Marks. Clark had specifically not wanted to work with former Byrds producer Terry Melcher, with whom the band had previously clashed.
To exaggerate the world that's only beating.
In 1991, Columbia reissued the album under the title Echoes, adding several previously unreleased recordings. It was only in the years following Clark's death in May 1991 that the album began receiving the attention it deserved. Today it is considered one of the finest solo recordings to emerge from the California rock scene of the 1960s, and one of the foundational documents of what would later be called country rock.
And the echoes in your head continue showing.
Number 6. Shifting Sands by the West Coast pop art experimental band.
It's slipping from your hand.
The name alone tells you something about this group. The West Coast pop art experimental band operated in Los Angeles in the mid to late 1960s and existed entirely outside the commercial mainstream, partly by choice, partly by circumstance. The band consisted of brothers Danny and Sean Harris on guitar and bass, Michael Lloyd on guitar, Ron Morgan on lead guitar, John Ware on drums, and Bob Markley, a wealthy attorney who contributed spoken word performances and who had maneuvered himself into controlling the band's publishing rights. That last detail mattered enormously because Markley's control of publishing meant that his own surrealist spoken word tracks were often selected as singles, while the band's strongest melodic songs were largely bypassed. Shifting Sands opened the band's 1967 album Part 1, their first release on Reprise Records. The song was written by Baker Knight and showcased everything the band could do when left to pure melody: folk-inflected vocal harmonies, restrained lead guitar by Ron Morgan, and a quietly hypnotic atmosphere. A review in the Los Angeles Free Press praised the band's musicianship, but was sharply critical of Markley for his pretentious onstage attitude and non-rhythmic tambourine playing. That contrast between genuine musical talent and one controlling individual's eccentricity ran through everything the band recorded. Number 5. To Claudia on Thursday by the Millennium. To understand To Claudia on Thursday, you first need to know what was spent making it. The Millennium was assembled in 1968 by producer Kurt Becher, who had connections to the Beach Boys, The Association, and the Sagittarius Project. Their sole studio album, Begin, was recorded between March and August 1968, and by the time it was finished, Columbia Records had invested $100,000 in the project, making it the most expensive album ever recorded at that point in history. Begin was also the second album ever to use 16-track recording technology, following Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends. To Claudia on Thursday was written about Becher's wife, Claudia, who was pregnant during the recording. It is a sunshine pop composition in the warmest possible sense: layered harmonies, gentle orchestration, a quality some reviewers described as among the first examples of world music influences entering American pop. The co-producer on the album was Keith Olsen, who 5 years later would introduce Fleetwood Mac to Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, and go on to produce their landmark recordings together. Number 4. Little Hands by Skip Spence. In June 1968, Alexander Skip Spence was admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York. He had attempted to attack two of his Moby Grape bandmates, Don Stevenson and Jerry Miller, with a fire axe. He spent the next 6 months there, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and spent most of that time writing songs. Spence had already lived several musical lives by then. He had been a founding member of Jefferson Airplane, playing drums on their debut album despite barely being a drummer at the time. Marty Balin had spotted him at a rehearsal and recruited him on the spot. He left to form Moby Grape, a San Francisco band whose 1967 debut is still considered one of the great albums of that city's golden period. And then, somewhere along the way, the drugs and the mental illness caught up with him entirely. When he was released from Bellevue, he made his way to Nashville. Producer David Rubinson had arranged time at Columbia's studios there, with a patient engineer named Mike Figlio, who was instructed to keep the tapes running at all times, to record everything Spence did. Over 7 days in December 1968, Spence wandered around the studio picking up instruments apparently at random. Acoustic guitar, drums, whatever was within reach, he played everything himself. The sessions were raw, sparse, and strange. Spence believed he was recording demos. He handed the tapes to Rubinson with the expectation that they would be properly produced before release. Rubinson listened to what he had and sent them to Columbia exactly as they were. Or was released on May 19, 1969. Columbia did not promote it, It was deleted from their catalog within a year. For a long time, it held the distinction of being the lowest-selling album in the history of Columbia Records. Little Hands, which opens the record, is the most approachable moment on it. A darkly strummed acoustic piece that could almost have been a Moby Grape song, had it been made under any normal circumstances. The album's mythology grew slowly, in the way that only truly buried records can. By the mid-1990s, collectors had elevated it to near-legendary status. In 1999, a tribute album called More Ore was released, featuring contributions from Robert Plant, Tom Waits, Robin Hitchcock, and Beck, among others. Spence himself died that same year, at 52, never having recorded another album. He never fully recovered from the illness that had taken hold in 1968. Number 3. Witchy Tie 2 by Everything Is Everything. In 1969, a song appeared on the Billboard Hot 100 that was unlike anything the chart had ever contained. It reached number 69, received some late-night radio airplay, and then largely vanished from public memory. But the story behind it never quite went away. Jim Pepper was a jazz saxophonist of Kaw and Muskogee Creek Native American heritage. He had been a member of the Free Spirits, one of the very first jazz groups to incorporate rock rhythms into their sound, in what would later be called fusion. When the Free Spirits dissolved, Pepper and other members formed a new group called Everything Is Everything. Witchy Tie Toe was a song Pepper had learned from his grandfather. It was derived from a peyote song of the Native American church, a chant used in ceremonial practice. Pepper took that chant and built around it. Organ, flute, saxophone, bells. The meditative repetition of the chant became the center of the song, surrounded by a gentle, jazz-inflected arrangement that somehow belonged entirely to 1969, and entirely outside of time, all at once. It remains, to this day, the only hit song in the history of the Billboard pop charts to incorporate an authentic chant from an indigenous American tribe. In 1969 alone, it was covered by the sunshine pop group Harper's Bazaar, whose version featured slide guitar by Ry Cooder and was produced by Lenny Waronker, and by the folk duo Brewer and Shipley. An unreleased version was reportedly recorded that same year by the Supremes. Later, Keith Moon recorded a version under a pseudonym, and members of Yes and the Bonzo Dog Band contributed their own takes to the song's growing history. Jim Pepper continued recording for the rest of his life, working alongside jazz luminaries, including Don Cherry, Charlie Haydn, and John Scofield. He was posthumously inducted into the Native American Music Awards Hall of Fame in 2000. He died in 1992. In April 2007, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. accepted his saxophone and hat at a ceremony honoring his musical legacy. Number 2. My World Fell Down by Sagittarius. Sagittarius wasn't really a band. That's the first thing to understand. The name belonged to Gary Usher, a record producer and songwriter based in Los Angeles, who had previously co-written songs with Brian Wilson, including In My Room and 409 for the Beach Boys. By 1967, Usher had heard a recording of My World Fell Down by a British pop group called the Ivy League, and he believed it could be a hit in the right hands. He first offered it to the English duo Chad and Jeremy, whom he had been producing. They declined. They only wanted to record their own original songs. So Usher decided to record it himself, assembling a group of Los Angeles session musicians from the circle later known as the Wrecking Crew. Among them was Glenn Campbell, who sang the lead vocal. Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys contributed harmonies, along with Terry Melcher, producer and son of Doris Day. Singer-songwriter Kurt Boettcher was also brought in for vocals. There's a remarkable footnote to this story. While Usher was working on My World Fell Down at Columbia Recording Studios in Los Angeles, Brian Wilson was in an adjacent studio, recording Good Vibrations. The two men had collaborated closely in the past, and Wilson, who was increasingly battling anxiety at the time, was worried about his tapes being mishandled. The finished recording of My World Fell Down bore such a striking resemblance to the production style of Good Vibrations, in its string arrangements, vocal harmonies, and pop orchestral ambition, that some listeners at the time drew direct comparisons between the two. The truth was simpler. These were musicians who had all worked together, absorbing the same influences at the same moment in the same city. The song's most unusual feature was an extended section in the middle, a collage of voices and sounds unlike anything on a 1967 pop record. Usher himself later concluded this experimental passage had made it almost impossible for the song to be a top 40 hit. Released as a single in June 1967, it reached number 70 on the Billboard Hot 100. When it appeared on Sagittarius's album Present Tense in 1968, that experimental middle section had been removed entirely. Number 1. Another Time, by Pearls Before Swine. Tom Rapp was a teenager from Eau Gallie, Florida when he wrote Another Time. He wrote it after surviving a serious car accident in which he was thrown from the vehicle. The experience left him thinking about indifference, the universe's complete disregard for whether any individual lives or dies. That became the song. Rapp and his high school friends had been playing folk music together, inspired by Joan Baez and the Byrds. They recorded some songs onto a home reel-to-reel recorder, had 8 demo discs cut, and packaged them in hand-drawn sleeves with a band photograph taped to the front. One copy was sent to ESP Disc, a small independent New York label known for releasing the avant-garde rock theater group The Fugs. The label signed them. The group, called Pearls Before Swine, released their debut album One Nation Underground in 1967. Another Time opened the record. The album sold 250,000 copies, a remarkable number for a small independent label. Though Rapp later said the band never received any money from ESP Disc. Not even $100, he said. The sound of Pearls Before Swine was unlike almost anything else being made at the time. Rapp's voice was quiet, slightly lisped, and utterly serious. There were no concessions to radio or commerce. The album cover used Hieronymus Bosch's painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. The music dealt with war, mortality, and the weight of living. These were not songs designed for the charts. Rapp eventually left music, studied law at the University of Pennsylvania, and became a civil rights attorney. He died in February 2018. In the years after his passing, it was acknowledged by Bernie Taupin that Rapp's later song Rocket Man had directly inspired the Elton John hit of the same name. The 1960s were full of moments like these, songs recorded with real care by real musicians that simply didn't find their audience at the right time. Some of them are still waiting. If any of these caught your attention today, go find them. They're worth the search, and if you've made it all the way through, thank you for spending the time. If you enjoyed it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like these out there, and we're going to keep finding them.